site. Could you imagine a dam breaking and the damage to Kherson in southern Ukraine? Did you see that coming, Tina Fordham?
Well, we know that these kinds of tactics are pretty consistent with Russia's kind of scorched earth MO. And in fact, the Ukrainians told us that the Russians had mined the dam. And so we should have been prepared for something like this. We're in a very critical phase as we are in late spring with Ukraine's offensive, much anticipated. They keep denying or kind of hushing up when it's happening. This is really consistent with what Clausewitz called the fog of war. And that's very much where we are at this stage in the conflict.
How does this event change, I guess, the state of Ukraine and the war, and particularly the relationship of Ukraine to their allies?
Well, it's a setback, although, of course, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and President Zelensky are soft pedaling that. I mean, Ukrainians' morale remains remarkably high, troop morale and citizens. They're evacuating people. They'll deal with the humanitarian consequences. But you've seen, for example, that the water supply from the Kakhovka Dam is important, according to the IAEA, for cooling the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, which is something that I've been talking about, kind of below threshold actions that would constitute an escalation. And this is what investors are watching for, of course. Is the war escalating in a meaningful way where there might be spillover? Certainly the risk temperature now is much higher, but let's also bear in mind that Ukraine, in terms of its military preparedness, is in a much stronger position than it was this time a year ago. It's got the Leopard tanks, it's got the Abrams tanks. In fact, apparently the first NATO supplied tanks seen on the battlefield were French. So they are trained now in offensive maneuvers, but the pressure on this, the success of this offensive is extremely high. There's no question about it. The patience is running out, although the show of strength in terms of support for Ukraine at the G7, it remains very high, I think, defying a lot of international observers. But there's no doubt in my mind that everybody wants to see Ukraine gain leverage.
Tina, a lot of the focus right now is on the alliances, and that's the reason why perhaps some people, not us obviously, are focusing on Rishi Sunak down in Washington, D.C. I am wondering if you do think that is of interest in any way, that sort of plain vanilla conversation that we just heard of sort of vaguely self-congratulatory back and forth.
Apart from being so cringy. I mean,
but just in general, is there anything you're expecting to hear from this confab down in Washington, D.C. with Rishi Sunak?
For sure, they'll announce a show of unity and strength on Ukraine, and they will announce plans to continue arming and training Ukraine. That is a given. What Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, is not going to get is the digital trade deal slash, rare minerals, narrow trade deal that he's hoping for. Remember, he's a Prime Minister of a government that's 20 points behind in the polls. And the UK has elections next year, as well as the United States. So he's a prime minister in a weak position. And the relationship is frankly less of a strategic priority for Washington than when the UK was one of the most important members of the European Union and had a lot of other fellow free trade Atlanticist powers standing alongside it. So I think Sunak will be disappointed, but he'll still come away with something to show for his visit to DC.
How does that characterization of the UK stand up to the need for UK military support in places like Europe, the mainland, and the situation with Ukraine?
So this is really important, and I think I want to emphasize it for your international audience. Even if there is a Labour government next year, and I'm not making that call, despite the very pronounced lead in the polls. A lot can happen, as we know. You're not going to see a change away from the UK stance in support of Ukraine. Of this, we can depend.
Tina Fordham of Fordham Global Foresight. Tina,